The Seattle rain beat a steady, rhythmic lullaby against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their master bedroom. It was 2:14 a.m., the kind of quiet hour where the world feels utterly safe, tucked away under heavy duvets and the illusion of absolute trust. Then the phone on the marble nightstand buzzed, a harsh, aggressive vibration that shattered the peace. Andrew reached for his wife's phone to silence it, casually glancing at the screen. LS. He answered to stop the ringing, bringing it to his ear, expecting a wrong number. Instead, a man's gravelly voice whispered, "Did you get the money? Time is up, Vivi." Beside him, Vivienne woke up, saw the phone in his hand, and began to shake so violently the mattress trembled. If stories of hidden truths, dark sacrifices, and the heavy price of secrets speak to you, stay with me. The Seattle rain was relentless. It drummed against the thick, floor-to-ceiling glass of their master bedroom, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that usually pulled Andrew Brooks into a deep, dreamless sleep. The room was dark, save for the faint, amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the sheer curtains. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of expensive linen and Vivienne's signature lavender perfume. It was 2:14 a.m. Andrew shifted beneath the heavy duvet, his arm reaching out instinctively to pull his wife closer, but his fingers brushed against empty, cold sheets. He blinked, groggy, the fog of sleep thick in his mind. Before he could sit up to look for her, a harsh, buzzing vibration shattered the quiet of the room. It wasn't his phone. The sound came from Vivienne's side of the bed. Her sleek smartphone was vibrating angrily against the marble surface of the nightstand, the screen illuminating the dark corner of the room with a glaring, bluish-white light. Andrew rubbed his eyes, annoyed by the intrusion. Vivienne was a creative director. Late-night emails from overseas clients weren't entirely uncommon, but phone calls at this hour were unprecedented. He leaned over, intending to hit the sleep button so it wouldn't wake her, wherever she was in the house. But as his hand hovered over the device, his eyes caught the caller IDLS, just initials. No picture, no full name. The phone continued to buzz, a persistent, demanding insect. Driven by a mix of sleep-deprived confusion and mild concern, Andrew swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Vivi, are you there?" Andrew murmured, his voice thick with sleep. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The background noise sounded like a busy street, the sharp honk of a distant taxi cutting through the static. "Did you get the money?" The voice was male. It was gravelly, low, and laced with an impatience that made the hairs on the back of Andrew's neck stand up. "I told you time is up, Vivi. I'm not playing games anymore." Andrew's breath hitched. The last remnants of sleep vanished, replaced by a sudden, icy clarity. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand who the hell was calling his wife at 2 a.m. asking for money, but a sharp gasp from the doorway stopped him. He looked up. Vivienne was standing there, framed by the soft light of the hallway. She was wearing her silk robe, holding a glass of water. Her eyes fell on the phone pressed against Andrew's ear. In a fraction of a second, every drop of blood drained from her face. She looked like a ghost, a marble statue frozen in absolute terror. The glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, water and shards of crystal exploding across the room. But Vivienne didn't look at the mess. She was staring at the phone. "Hello," the voice on the line barked. "Vivi?" Andrew slowly lowered the device, his eyes locked on his wife. "Who is LS?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Vivienne took a step backward, and then she began to shake. It wasn't a subtle tremble. It was a violent, full-body shudder. Her teeth audibly chattered, her knees knocked together, and she wrapped her arms around her own torso as if trying to hold herself together from falling apart completely. She looked like a woman who had just stared into the barrel of a loaded gun. "Andrew!" she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, breathless and panicked. "Andrew, please, hang up." Andrew looked at the glowing screen in his hand, the timer counting the seconds of the active call, and then back at the woman he had loved for 7 years. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. The click of the end call button sounded like a gunshot in the quiet bedroom. Andrew placed the smartphone back on the marble nightstand. He didn't move toward the shattered crystal on the hardwood floor. He didn't move toward his wife. He simply sat on the edge of the mattress, the cold, damp air of the Seattle night settling over his bare shoulders. "I will ask you one more time," Andrew said. His voice was a flat, terrifying monotone. "Who is LS?" Vivienne stood paralyzed near the doorway. The violent tremors racking her body had not subsided. She wrapped her silk robe tighter around herself, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked at the broken glass, then at Andrew, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw a full breath. "His name is Lance," she whispered. Her voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of the syllables. "Lance Silver. And why is Lance Silver calling my wife at 2 in the morning, asking if she got the money?" The corporate lawyer in Andrew was taking over. It was a practiced defense mechanism, locking his shattering heart behind a fortress of cold, analytical logic. He needed facts. He needed a timeline. Vivienne closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her pale cheek, but her facial muscles remained oddly rigid. "Because he is blackmailing me." Andrew frowned, confusion momentarily overriding the deep, twisting knot in his stomach. "Blackmailing you for what?" "Because we—" She choked on the words, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. "Because we have been sleeping together, Andrew. For 6 months. We met at the Sapphire Lounge. It was a mistake. It meant absolutely nothing. But he took pictures. He said if I didn't pay him $50,000, he would send them to your partners at the firm." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. An affair. 6 months. A cheap, sordid hotel room cliché. Andrew felt the floor drop beneath him. The 7 years of their pristine marriage, the quiet Sunday mornings, the unwavering trust, all of it felt instantly tainted, painted over with the filthy brush of betrayal. He wanted to scream. He wanted to hurl the heavy brass bedside lamp against the wall. But as he stared at his wife, a strange, chilling dissonance settled over his grief. Andrew spent his days in deposition rooms. He interrogated hostile witnesses, cornered embezzling executives, and watched people's carefully constructed lies crumble under pressure. He knew exactly what guilt looked like. Guilt was defensive. Guilt was tearful apologies, averted gazes, and desperate, messy pleas for forgiveness. Vivienne was not displaying guilt. She was displaying primal, unadulterated terror. Her eyes were wide, dilated in the dim light. The shaking was so severe she had to lean heavily against the doorframe to keep her legs from giving out. She wasn't looking at him with the sorrow of a woman who had broken her sacred vows. She was looking at him with the raw panic of a trapped animal, listening to the approaching footsteps of a predator. "You're lying," Andrew said softly, the observation slipping out before he could stop it. Vivienne flinched violently, as if he had struck her across the face. "I'm not. I swear to God, Andrew. It's just an affair. I'm so sorry. I will pay him. I will make him go away. Just please, don't ask any more questions." "It's just an affair." The phrasing echoed in Andrew's mind. Who describes the total destruction of their marriage as just an affair? She was offering up her infidelity like a shield, eagerly confessing to a lesser crime to hide a much greater sin. Andrew stood up slowly, his bare feet stepping carefully around the jagged shards of glass. He walked over to the closet and pulled down his leather overnight bag from the top shelf. "Andrew, what are you doing?" Her voice pitched higher, a note of genuine hysteria finally bleeding through the panic. "I'm leaving," he replied, not looking at her as he began methodically shoving clothes into the duffel bag. He didn't know what the truth was tonight. He only knew that the woman trembling in the doorway was a stranger, and the confession she had just handed him was a desperate, poorly constructed lie designed to keep him in the dark. The zipper of the leather duffel bag closed with a sharp, definitive rasp that seemed to echo off the bedroom walls. Andrew didn't pack much. Just enough suits for a few days at the office and a handful of essentials. He moved with a mechanical precision, his mind forcefully detaching from the surreal nightmare unfolding around him. Vivienne remained rooted by the doorway, her silence heavier than any excuse she could have offered. She didn't try to physically stop him. She didn't fall to her knees or weep into her hands as the guilty spouses in his divorce cases so often did. She just watched him with those wide, terrified eyes, still clutching the edges of her silk robe as if it were the only thing holding her together. Without a word, Andrew picked up his bag and walked past her. He didn't look back as he descended the sweeping oak staircase of their home. The front door clicked shut behind him, sealing away the life he thought he knew. Outside, the Seattle rain was unforgiving. It soaked through the shoulders of his overcoat in the brief seconds it took to reach his car. The leather interior of his sedan felt cold and hollow. As he pulled out of the driveway, his headlights swept across the manicured lawn, illuminating the pristine facade of a house built on a foundation of sudden, incomprehensible deceit. 20 minutes later, he was checking into the Archer Hotel downtown. The night clerk barely glanced at him, accustomed to the weary faces of businessmen arriving at ungodly hours. Room 412 was sterile and quiet, smelling faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and heavily starched linens. It was the exact opposite of the warm, lavender-scented bedroom he had just abandoned. Andrew dropped his bag on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the stiff mattress. He didn't turn on the main lights, letting the neon glow of the city bleed through the half-open blinds. In the suffocating silence of the hotel room, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his chest. His wife had been sleeping with another man for 6 months. The thought should have paralyzed him with grief. It should have broken him completely. But the corporate lawyer in him wouldn't let the grief take root. Not yet. His mind, trained for years to dissect testimonies, hunt for perjury, was already tearing Vivienne's confession apart. We met at the Sapphire Lounge. It was a mistake. He took pictures. He replayed the scene in the bedroom, analyzing her every micro-expression, the sudden, violent trembling, the blood draining from her face, the way she had practically begged him to believe her story of infidelity. She had offered up the affair like a sacrificial lamb, hoping the sheer shock of it would blind him to whatever was truly hiding in the shadows. And then there was the caller, Lance Silver. The gravelly voice hadn't sounded like a scorned lover or a sleazy opportunist looking for a quick payout from compromising photos. The tone had been chillingly professional, impatient, and dangerous. "Did you get the money? Time is up." Those were not the words of a romantic entanglement gone wrong. They were the words of a transaction, a debt coming due. Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, pressing the heels of his hands against his tired eyes. The math of her betrayal simply didn't add up. A $50,000 extortion plot over a 6-month affair? Vivienne made excellent money as a creative director. She could have quietly liquidated her own investments to pay a blackmailer if she was truly desperate to hide a mere indiscretion. Why wait until a 2 a.m. phone call shattered the illusion? Because Andrew realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach, the $50,000 wasn't for photos, and the terror in her eyes wasn't about losing her marriage. She was afraid of something else entirely, and Andrew was going to find out exactly what it was. The morning light filtering through the greasy, rain-streaked windows of the Sunrise Cafe was the color of bruised iron. Andrew sat in a cracked vinyl corner booth, his untouched black coffee growing a film on its surface. He hadn't slept a single minute. The crisp lines of his charcoal suit, usually a symbol of his authority at Bennett and Hayes, now felt like heavy, suffocating armor. Across the table sat Brian Cooper. Brian was a man whose appearance perfectly suited his profession, entirely forgettable. He wore a faded trench coat and possessed a face that blended seamlessly into any crowd. He was a private investigator whom Andrew had quietly retained a handful of times to dig up dirt on hostile corporate witnesses. He was cynical, sharp, and brutally efficient. Andrew slid a small, folded slip of hotel stationery across the Formica table. It contained a phone number and a name. Lance Silver. "My wife told me she's having an affair with him," Andrew said, the words scraping against his throat like dry ash. "She claims he's blackmailing her with compromising photos for $50,000. She said they met at the Sapphire Lounge." Brian picked up the paper, his dull eyes scanning the ink without a flicker of emotion. He opened a battered laptop, tethering it to his smartphone with a frayed cable. The diner hummed around them, the clinking of silverware, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of morning commuters. A mundane symphony entirely disconnected from the collapse of Andrew's universe. Minutes passed. The rhythmic tapping of Brian's keyboard sounded like a metronome ticking down to an inevitable explosion. Andrew watched the rain carve erratic paths down the windowpane, his mind playing Vivienne's terrified trembling on an endless loop. "Mr. Brooks," Brian finally spoke, his voice a low gravel that cut through the diner's noise. He turned the laptop screen slightly toward Andrew. I've been working in Seattle a long time. I know the kind of men who frequent the Sapphire Lounge. Tech money, trust funds, board executives looking to feel young. Andrew shifted his gaze to the screen. A police mugshot glared back at him. The man in the photograph had a thick, bullish neck, cold, dead eyes, and a jagged, poorly healed scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked like a man who solved problems with a tire iron, not a man who seduced wealthy women in upscale cocktail bars. This, Brian tapped the screen with a blunt fingernail, is Lance Silver. He does not drink at the Sapphire Lounge. He doesn't know what an espresso martini is. He's a career enforcer. Andrew stopped breathing. 2 stints at Monroe Correctional, Brian continued, scrolling down the digital file. Aggravated assault, grand larceny, and a string of severe extortion charges that never stuck because the witnesses suddenly developed a habit of leaving the state or losing their memory. Andrew felt the blood drain from his extremities, pooling like lead in his stomach. He stared at the violent, brutish face on the screen. The image of his elegant, refined Vivienne, a woman who spent weeks agonizing over the exact shade of imported Italian marble for a client's foyer, who curated every aspect of their life with flawless precision, entangled romantically with a monster like this was not just improbable. It was grotesque. It was an insult to logic. She lied, Andrew murmured. The realization didn't bring relief. It solidified into cold, suffocating dread. Spouses lie all the time, counselor, Brian said, softly closing the laptop. But usually they lie to make themselves look innocent. They don't invent a home-wrecking affair to cover up something else. Unless what? Andrew demanded, his voice tight. Unless whatever she's actually doing with a ghost like Lance Silver is so incredibly dangerous, so utterly unforgivable, that blowing up her 7-year marriage seemed like the safest option. Brian took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. You want me to dig deeper? Because if I start turning over rocks in Lance Silver's yard, the things that crawl out are going to get very ugly, very fast. Andrew looked back out the window at the relentless storm. The agonizing grief of a betrayed husband was rapidly dissolving, replaced by the chilling terror of a man realizing he had been sleeping next to a stranger carrying a lethal secret. Dig, Andrew said, his tone turning to ice. Find out what my wife is buying for $50,000. The elevator doors opened to the pristine, minimalist reception area of the design firm. Natural light poured through the skylights, illuminating the imported Italian marble floors Vivienne had so painstakingly sourced. It was a sanctuary of order and aesthetics, a stark contrast to the chaotic ruins of their marriage. Andrew walked past the receptionist without a word, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. Rachel Green, Vivienne's closest colleague, looked up from a drafting table as he passed. Her polite smile faltered at the dark, thunderous expression on Andrew's face, but he didn't offer a greeting. He simply pushed open the heavy glass door to Vivienne's corner office and let it swing shut behind him, the soundproofing instantly muting the ambient hum of the studio. Vivienne was standing by the window, staring blankly at the Seattle skyline. She wore a tailored cream suit, her hair pulled into a flawless chignon. From the outside, she looked like the epitome of professional control. But when she turned to face him, the illusion shattered. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. Andrew, she breathed, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of her glass desk. You shouldn't be here. Andrew didn't sit. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out the folded printout Brian Cooper had given him, and dropped it onto the pristine surface of her desk. It landed next to a stack of fabric swatches. The brutal, scarred face of Lance Silver stared up at the ceiling. He doesn't drink at the Sapphire Lounge, Vivi, Andrew said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. He's a career enforcer, extortion, aggravated assault, 2 stints at Monroe Correctional. Vivienne stared at the photograph. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly white. She didn't feign confusion. She didn't act like a woman whose lover had lied about his past. She looked like a woman who had just been handed her own execution order. You went digging, she whispered, her voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. Andrew, Why did you go digging? Because your lie was pathetic, he replied, leaning his palms heavily against the desk, forcing her to look at him. You invented an affair to cover up whatever transaction you have with this monster. You broke my heart to push me away. Why? What are you buying for $50,000? Stop it, Vivienne gasped. She backed away from the desk, her breath coming in short, erratic hitches. The polished, elegant creative director was vanishing, replaced by a terrified creature cornered in a glass cage. You have to stop, Andrew. Just accept the divorce. Accept that I betrayed you and let it go. I am a lawyer, Vivienne. I don't let inconsistencies go. I rip them apart. This isn't a deposition, she hissed, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her makeup. She crossed the room and grabbed his lapels, her fingers digging desperately into the wool of his coat. Please, I am begging you. If you ever loved me, if our marriage meant anything to you, you will walk out of this building, sign the papers, and never look into Lance Silver again. You have no idea what you are doing. Her hysteria was not an act. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-like thumping of her heart against his chest. She was shaking again, that same visceral, bone-deep tremor from the night before. Tell me the truth, he demanded softly, looking down into her terrified eyes. I am, she sobbed, dropping her hands and taking a ragged step back. I am sleeping with him. He's dangerous and I got in too deep, and I just need to pay him to survive. That is the truth. It was a desperate, transparent fabrication. Andrew looked at his wife, realizing with a cold, terrifying certainty that she was willing to destroy her own reputation, her marriage, and her entire life just to keep him blind to the darkness she was hiding. He picked up the photograph, slipped it back into his pocket, and turned toward the door. The investigation was no longer about a broken heart. It was about survival. The relentless Seattle rain had turned the city into a blurred canvas of smeared neon and gray shadows. Andrew sat low in the driver's seat of his sedan, parked half a block away from the gleaming glass facade of the Meridian. The luxury apartment building was a fortress of wealth, an incongruous setting for a meeting with a man who had 2 stints at Monroe Correctional on his record. Through the rhythmic sweeping of his windshield wipers, Andrew kept his eyes locked on the building's side entrance, a discreet, dimly lit alleyway meant for service staff and private exits. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel with enough force to turn his knuckles white. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:45 p.m. 10 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled to the curb. Vivienne stepped out into the downpour. She wasn't holding an umbrella. She wore a dark trench coat, the collar turned up against the wind, and clutched a heavy canvas duffel bag to her chest. She looked small, fragile, and entirely out of place in the grim, industrial shadows of the alley. Andrew held his breath, the lawyer in him automatically cataloging every detail of the scene. Then the heavy metal service door creaked open. A hulking figure stepped out from the stairwell. Even from 50 yards away, Andrew recognized the thick, bullish neck and the menacing posture from Brian Cooper's file. Lance Silver. He didn't look like a secret lover waiting for a midnight rendezvous. He moved with the coiled, predatory grace of a man accustomed to violence. Andrew's pulse hammered against his ribs. His instinct screamed at him to throw the car door open, to run across the wet asphalt and put himself between his wife and the enforcer. But the cold, analytical part of his brain, the part that knew his wife was playing a lethal game of chess, kept him anchored to the seat. If he intervened now, Vivienne's wall of lies would only grow thicker. He needed to see it play out. Under the flickering amber glow of a security light, Vivienne approached Lance. There was no embrace, no illicit touch of hands, no whispered sweet nothings of an affair gone wrong. Instead, Vivienne shrank back as Lance stepped into her personal space. The enforcer reached out, his massive hand closing brutally around her upper arm. Even through the rain-streaked windshield, Andrew could see the sharp wince of pain that flashed across her face. Lance yanked the duffel bag from her grip with his other hand, roughly unzipping it to inspect the $50,000 nestled inside. The transaction was entirely devoid of affection. It was steeped in raw, palpable dominance and subjugation. Lance leaned down, his face inches from Vivienne's, speaking words Andrew couldn't hear over the pounding storm. Whatever he said made Vivienne squeeze her eyes shut and nod frantically, her shoulders trembling under her soaked coat. Lance sneered, zipping the bag shut. He gave her a final, dismissive shove that nearly sent her stumbling backward onto the wet pavement, then turned and vanished back through the metal door. Vivienne stood alone in the rain for a long moment, clutching her bruised arm. She looked completely broken. In the darkness of his car, Andrew exhaled a shaky breath. The final, microscopic sliver of doubt he had harbored, the irrational fear that perhaps she really was just having a bizarre, self-destructive affair, evaporated completely. This was an extortion drop. It was a hostage paying her captor. She had looked him in the eye and destroyed their marriage to keep him away from this exact alley. As Andrew watched his wife slowly walk back to her waiting car, the devastating reality settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Vivienne wasn't just hiding a secret, she was drowning in one, and she had deliberately chosen to drown alone, rather than pull him down with her. The taillights of Vivienne's town car bled into the hazy Seattle downpour, disappearing around the corner. Andrew didn't wait for his pulse to settle. He shoved the gear shift into park, killed the headlights, and stepped out into the freezing rain. He moved quickly across the wet asphalt, his charcoal overcoat heavy with water. Lance Silver was halfway down the alley, moving with the unhurried, arrogant gait of a man who owned the shadows. The heavy canvas duffel bag hung effortlessly from his massive shoulder. "Silver!" Andrew called out. His voice was remarkably steady, slicing through the rhythmic drumming of the storm. The enforcer stopped. He didn't flinch or reach for a weapon inside his jacket. He turned around slowly, the amber security light catching the jagged, ugly scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked at Andrew's tailored suit, his soaked leather shoes, and the rigid, furious set of his jaw. A slow, dark amusement crept into Lance's eyes. "Well," Lance rasped, his voice sounding like heavy boots grinding over loose gravel. "If it isn't the husband, I was wondering if you had the spine to step out of that sedan." Andrew closed the distance between them, stopping just out of arm's reach. Up close, the sheer physical menace of the man was suffocating. Lance smelled of stale tobacco, damp wool, and something fundamentally violent. $50,000 is a steep price for a few compromising photographs, Andrew said, keeping his tone perfectly level, projecting the same icy authority he used in a hostile deposition. "Especially for a 6-month affair." Lance stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then a low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest. It took Andrew a second to realize the man was laughing. It was a cold, hollow sound that offered absolutely no warmth. "An affair?" Lance chuckled, shaking his head. He adjusted the thick strap of the duffel bag, looking Andrew up and down with profound pity. "Is that what she told you, counselor? That we were playing house at the local cocktail lounge?" "It's what she confessed to," Andrew replied, his jaw tight. Lance took a step forward. The amusement vanished from his brutal face, replaced by a dead-eyed seriousness. He invaded Andrew's space, towering over him, the physical threat hanging heavy in the damp air. "Look at me, suit," Lance whispered, gesturing to his own scarred, weathered face and rough, calloused hands. "Do I look like the kind of man a woman like Vivienne DuPont takes to bed? She wears silk that costs more than my car. She looks at me like I'm a disease she scraped off her shoe. There is no affair." The confirmation hit Andrew like a physical blow, even though the logical part of his brain already knew it was true. Hearing it spoken aloud by the monster himself solidified the nightmare. "Then what are you selling her?" Andrew demanded, refusing to back down, the lawyer in him pushing for the final piece of evidence. "What did I just watch her pay for?" "She isn't buying anything," Lance sneered, leaning closer, the rain dripping from his heavy brow. "She's renting. She's renting my silence. And let me tell you something about your perfect, terrified little wife. She didn't invent some cheap story about cheating on you because she wanted to break your heart." Lance tapped a thick, heavy finger against Andrew's chest, right over his heart. "She told you that lie because she thought it was the only way to save you from the blast radius. If I were you, I would take the divorce papers and run, because the truth she is hiding in that pretty little head of hers, it won't just ruin your marriage, Brooks. It will put you both in a concrete box." Lance stepped back, the mocking grin returning as he turned to walk away into the suffocating darkness of the alley. "Enjoy the severance package, counselor," Lance called over his shoulder, his massive form swallowed by the shadows. And tell Vivi I'll be in touch. Silver! Andrew's voice cracked like a whip in the damp alleyway. He didn't let the enforcer walk away. Driven by a reckless, blinding need for the truth, Andrew lunged forward, his hand catching the heavy, wet wool of Lance's coat. Lance turned, a flash of genuine, practiced violence igniting in his dead eyes. He didn't throw a punch, but he shoved Andrew backward with terrifying, effortless force. Andrew hit the wet brick wall of the alley, the breath leaving his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. "Don't push your luck, Brooks," Lance snarled, stepping into Andrew's space, pinning him with his sheer size. "You are way out of your depth." "Tell me," Andrew gasped, ignoring the dull ache radiating through his shoulder blades. "What concrete box? If she isn't cheating, what the hell is she paying you for?" Lance stared at the desperate, broken man pressed against the brick. The enforcer let out a slow, cold breath, the dark amusement returning to his scarred face. He decided to twist the knife. "You really are blind," Lance murmured, his gravelly voice barely rising above the storm. "Let's take a trip down memory lane. 5 years ago, the Pearson chemical spill case, the one that made you a junior partner and bought that pretty house you just walked out of." Andrew froze. The Pearson case was his crown jewel. A whistleblower had anonymously mailed him the damning internal corporate documents that secured a multi-million-dollar settlement. It was the turning point of his entire career. "Your whistleblower didn't just decide to mail you that flash drive out of the goodness of his heart," Lance said, leaning closer. "He was going to sell it to the highest bidder. Vivienne found out. She knew if Pearson's goons got to him first, your career was over. So she went to meet him at the old shipyard to buy it herself." The alley started to spin. Andrew couldn't breathe. "Things got heated," Lance continued, his tone chillingly casual. "The guy wanted more money. Vivienne panicked. It was pouring rain, just like tonight. She got in her SUV to leave. He tried to block her, and she stepped on the gas." Lance clicked his tongue. "A heavy car and a slick road, counselor. She didn't mean to do it, but she still crushed his chest under her tires." Andrew's heart stopped. The world narrowed down to the sound of the rain and the horrifying words echoing off the brick. "I was the guy called in to clean up the mess," Lance finished. "I made the body disappear. I scrubbed the bumper of her car. And I made sure that little flash drive ended up on your desk the next morning. You built your entire empire on a dead man's bones, Brooks. She's been paying my retainer ever since, making sure the cops stay blind so you don't lose your license and go to prison as an accessory." Lance stepped back, letting the horrific reality sink in. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the Seattle night, leaving Andrew sliding down the rough brick wall, gasping for air. It took Andrew an hour to navigate his car back to the Archer Hotel. His hands were numb. His brilliant analytical mind was shattered into a million jagged pieces. Vivienne hadn't betrayed him. She had damned her own soul to ensure his success, carrying the agonizing weight of a murderer's guilt entirely alone. She had chosen to let him hate her as a cheater rather than destroy his life with the truth. When he pushed open the door to room 412, the space was as sterile and cold as he had left it. But on the small desk by the window, sitting squarely in the pale glow of the street lamp, was a thick manila envelope. Andrew walked toward it with heavy mechanical steps. He recognized her elegant, looping handwriting on the front. He tore it open. Inside was the final, devastating blow. It was the divorce petition. Vivienne had already signed the bottom of the last page. Andrew stared at her signature. The blue ink was smeared, the heavy parchment warped and blistered by the unmistakable marks of her falling tears. She was legally severing them, cutting him loose to save him from the sinking ship of her sins. Beneath the legal documents lay a single sheet of heavy cardstock, a handwritten note. Andrew picked it up, his own tears finally spilling over his lashes as he read her final confession. "Some lies are born from malice, Andrew, but the worst ones, the ones that truly break you, are born from love." The drive back to the house was a blur of smeared neon and relentless rain. Andrew left the signed divorce papers and the devastating note on the desk of his sterile hotel room. He could not sign them. He could not run. The analytical machinery of his mind had shut down, leaving only a hollow, agonizing ache in his chest. Lance Silver's words echoed relentlessly over the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. You built your entire empire on a dead man's bones. When Andrew pushed the heavy oak front door open, the house was entirely dark, save for the dying embers in the living room fireplace. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against his eardrums. He shrugged off his soaked overcoat, letting it drop to the hardwood floor, and walked toward the faint orange glow. Vivienne was sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa. She was no longer wearing the pristine cream suit from the office, nor the trench coat from the alley. She wore a simple gray cashmere sweater, her legs pulled to her chest, her chin resting on her knees. A crystal tumbler of scotch sat untouched on the glass coffee table. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. She didn't look up when his footsteps stopped at the edge of the Persian rug. She assumed he had come back for more clothes or perhaps to hurl one final justified accusation at her before walking out forever. I spoke to Lance, Andrew said. His voice was a raw, broken rasp that didn't sound like his own. Vivienne flinched. The slight movement was the only indication she had heard him. He didn't tell me about an affair, Vivi, Andrew continued, taking a slow step forward. His heart hammered against his ribs, a heavy, painful rhythm. He told me about the shipyard. He told me about the rain, the flash drive, and the Pearson settlement. Vivienne slowly raised her head. The amber light from the fireplace caught the wet, shining tracks of tears on her pale cheeks. The mask of the terrified, cheating wife was completely gone. In its place was a woman who had carried the weight of a corpse on her shoulders for 5 years, and the sheer exhaustion of it was finally breaking her in half. You weren't supposed to know, she whispered. Her voice was utterly devoid of the frantic hysteria from her office. It was flat, hollow, and infinitely sad. You were supposed to hate me. You were supposed to think I was a disgusting, unfaithful cliché. Take the house and leave. Andrew fell to his knees in front of the sofa. He didn't care about the damp cold of his suit trousers or the loss of his composure. He reached out, his trembling hands gently grasping her cold, rigid wrists. You killed a man, he choked out, the reality of the words burning his throat. You ran him down to protect a piece of evidence for my case, and then you let a monster like Silver clean it up. Why? Dear God, Vivi, why didn't you come to me? Because you are a good man, Andrew, she said, finally looking directly into his eyes. There was a tragic, desperate clarity in her gaze. You took an oath. If I had told you what happened that night, you would have reported it. You would have surrendered the evidence. Your career would have ended before it began, and you would have gone to prison just for trying to protect me after the fact. She pulled one of her hands free and gently traced the line of his jaw, her touch feather-light. I couldn't let my mistake destroy the brilliant man you were meant to become, she murmured, new tears spilling over her lashes. So I paid Lance to make it go away, and when he demanded more, when I couldn't hide the missing money anymore, I realized I had to become the villain. If you caught me cheating, you would leave. The crossfire wouldn't touch you. You would be safe. Andrew closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against her knees. The profound, toxic depth of her love was a crushing weight. She had willingly shattered her own soul and then deliberately destroyed her marriage, entirely to keep him standing in the light. I don't want to be safe, Andrew wept, the tears he had held back for 2 days finally breaking free. Not if it costs me you? Vivienne stroked his hair, her own sobs silent and devastating in the quiet dark room. The lie was dead, but the truth was a poison they were both now forced to drink. The gray dawn bled through the kitchen windows, offering no warmth to the freezing Seattle morning. Andrew sat at the edge of the marble island, watching Vivienne wrap her trembling fingers around a ceramic mug. The devastating confession from the night before hung in the air between them, a heavy, invisible shroud. They hadn't slept. The agonizing truth had stripped them down to their absolute core, leaving nothing but the raw, bleeding tissue of a marriage built on a graveyard. His phone buzzed against the granite countertop. The sudden vibration shattered the fragile, exhausted silence. Andrew glanced down at the illuminated screen. It was Thomas Hayes, the senior partner at Bennett and Hayes and his oldest mentor. Andrew answered, keeping his eyes fixed on his wife's pale, hollowed face. Thomas, it's early. I need you awake, Andrew. Hayes's voice crackled through the speaker, tight and purely professional. I just got off the phone with a contact at the precinct. The new assistant district attorney is making a name for herself by pulling cold cases. She's quietly reopening the file on the John Doe from the shipyard, the one connected to our Pearson settlement. The oxygen instantly vanished from the kitchen. Andrew felt a cold, metallic dread pool in his stomach. He didn't speak. He couldn't form the words. They found a discrepancy in the original forensics report regarding the tire tread marks, Hayes continued, entirely oblivious to the world ending on the other side of the line. It's a long shot, but if they trace the vehicle, they might try to subvert the settlement under the guise of witness tampering or corporate espionage. I need you in the office in an hour to prep a defensive strategy for the firm. We cannot let this touch us. I understand, Andrew managed to say, his voice a flat, deadened echo. I'll be there. He disconnected the call and set the phone face down. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was no longer the quiet of shared grief. It was the rapid, deafening ticking of a countdown clock. Vivienne looked up from her untouched coffee. She didn't need to ask. She had spent 5 years in a state of hypervigilance, analyzing every shift in his demeanor, every late-night phone call, waiting for the floor to finally drop out from beneath her. They are reopening it, she stated. It wasn't a question. Her voice was remarkably steady, the frantic terror from the previous days replaced by a chilling, fatalistic calm. Andrew nodded slowly. The moral foundation of his entire existence was violently fracturing under his feet. He was an officer of the court. He had sworn a solemn oath to uphold the law, a principle that defined his entire identity and career. But as he looked at the woman who had deliberately shattered her own soul to protect that very identity, the concept of the law felt entirely meaningless. If he walked into the firm and built a legal firewall to protect the Pearson settlement, he would officially become an accessory after the fact. He would be using his brilliance to actively hide a manslaughter. He would cross a definitive line from which he could never, ever return. Andrew, Vivienne said softly. She stood up from the stool, walked around the marble island, and placed her small, cold hand over his. You cannot be involved in this. If you try to protect me now, Silver will use you as a shield the second the police knock on his door. He will drag you down into the dark with him. I am not letting you go to prison, Andrew whispered fiercely, his fingers tightening desperately around hers. The analytical, composed lawyer was dying, rapidly replaced by a desperate husband clinging to the wreckage of his life. You don't have a choice anymore, she replied, offering him a tragic, broken smile. The choice was made in the rain, 5 years ago. I just needed you to know the truth before the end. She let go of his hand. The absence of her touch felt like a physical amputation in the freezing kitchen. Vivienne turned away from the marble island, her movements slow but terrifyingly deliberate, and began to walk toward the staircase. Where are you going? Andrew demanded, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, catching her by the shoulders. The brilliant, unflappable corporate lawyer was completely gone, replaced by a man watching his universe collapse in real time. We can fight this, Vivi. I know the ADA. I know how they build these cold cases. The forensics on the tire treads are circumstantial after 5 years. Silver is an unreliable witness with a massive criminal record. I can dismantle him on the stand. I can... Stop, Vivienne whispered. She didn't turn around, but her hands came up to rest gently over his trembling fingers on her shoulders. Just stop, Andrew. I am not letting you walk into a precinct, he said, his breathing shallow and frantic. I don't care about the firm. I don't care about the Pearson settlement or my license. I will burn it all to the ground before I let you take the fall for a mistake made in a panic. Vivienne slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, usually so vibrant and full of creative fire, were utterly hollowed out, carrying the weight of a ghost she had lived with for half a decade. You aren't listening to me, she said softly, her tone carrying a devastating, maternal patience. If you step into a courtroom to defend me, Lance Silver will not take the stand. He will not let you cross-examine him. He is an enforcer, Andrew. If he feels cornered, if he thinks you are going to pin the cover-up on him to save me, he will kill you. Or he will leak the extortion trail to the press before the trial even begins, proving you built your career on stolen evidence. Andrew stared at her, the blood rushing in his ears. The trap was perfectly, flawlessly set. It had been set the moment she handed Silver that first envelope of cash 5 years ago. I am the liability, Vivienne continued, her voice breaking on the word. The only way this ends without destroying you is if I confess. I will tell them I acted alone. I will tell them I hit him, panicked, and paid a fixer to hide the car. I will swear under oath that you knew absolutely nothing about the flash drive's origins. Your hands stay clean. She stepped away from his grasp and walked up the stairs. Andrew followed her, a hollow phantom in his own home. He watched from the bedroom doorway as she bypassed her closet full of tailored designer suits and silk dresses. Instead, she pulled out a simple pair of dark jeans and a heavy wool sweater. She was shedding the armor of Vivienne DuPont, the acclaimed creative director, preparing to step into the fluorescent, sterile reality of a booking room. You can't do this, Andrew wept, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his chest heaving. You are my wife. I am supposed to protect you. And you have, she replied, pulling the sweater over her head. She didn't look at the shattered crystals still resting in the corner of the room from the night of the phone call. She walked over to the nightstand, opening the top drawer. She pulled out the manila envelope she had left at his hotel the day before. She walked over and pressed the thick envelope against Andrew's chest. I need you to sign the divorce papers, Andrew, she said, her tears finally falling freely, staining the collar of her sweater. Date them for 3 days ago, before Hayes called you, before the police reopened the file. Establish the timeline of our separation. Make it undeniable that we were already broken before the truth came out. Andrew looked down at the envelope, his hands refusing to take it. The paper felt heavier than lead. It was her final act of toxic, agonizing love. A sacrifice so absolute it demanded he abandon her to save himself. Please, she sobbed, finally breaking, pressing her forehead against his chest. Let me save you. It's the only thing that makes the last 5 years worth it. The interrogation room was exactly as Andrew had always imagined it, cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial-strength floor cleaner, and illuminated by a flickering, fluorescent hum that set his nerves on edge. He sat on one side of the metal table, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. For the first time in his professional life, he wasn't there as the formidable partner of Bennett and Hayes. He was there as a ghost. Across from him sat Vivienne. She was dressed in the simple wool sweater she had chosen at the house. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look younger, more fragile, and yet terrifyingly resolute. Her hands, devoid of her wedding ring, were folded neatly on the table. Between them lay the thick manila envelope, its edges frayed. Andrew reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his fountain pen. His hand shook so violently that the gold nib chattered against the cap. He looked at the last page of the divorce petition, at the blue ink where her name already sat, waiting for his. You don't have to do this, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the light. I can find another way. We can hire the best criminal defense team in the country. We could... Andrew, she interrupted, her voice soft but immovable. Look at me. He raised his eyes. The woman across from him was the person he loved more than his own life, yet she was already a world away. She had already confessed to the ADA in the next room. She had given them the location of the shipyard, the timeline of the affair used to hide the payments, and the details that only the driver could know. She had built a fortress around him with her own confession. If you don't sign these, everything I did was for nothing, she said, her eyes welling with a final, quiet grief. I need you to walk out of here and keep being the man I protected. If you go down with me, then the man I loved is dead anyway. Please, let me keep that one thing. Andrew felt his heart shatter, a slow, crystalline break that left him hollow. He realized then that the greatest act of love he could offer her wasn't a legal defense or a desperate rescue. It was the crushing burden of survival. He had to live the life she had bought with her freedom, carrying the weight of her secret until his own last breath. He pressed the pen to the paper. The nib dragged, catching on the parchment as his tears fell, blurring the ink of his signature. Andrew Brooks. With those two words, he legally severed himself from the only woman he would ever truly know. He was safe, he was free, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone. He pushed the papers toward her. Vivienne reached out, her fingers brushing his for one last, fleeting second. a touch that carried the ghost of 7 years of marriage, of Seattle rain, and a dark shipyard night. "Go," she whispered. Andrew stood up. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the heavy steel door. He stopped at the threshold, his hand on the cold handle, and turned back one last time. Vivienne was staring at the blank wall, her shoulders finally sagging as the weight of the confession took hold. "I'll never forget," he said, his voice thick with a promise that felt like a curse. "I know," she replied, not looking back. "That's the price we pay." He stepped out into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a sound of absolute finality. He walked past the detectives, past the clicking of keyboards and the mundane noise of the precinct, and stepped out into the Seattle rain. It was the same rain that had washed the blood from her car 5 years ago. The same rain that had fallen the night he answered the phone. He stood on the sidewalk, a successful man with a pristine reputation and a brilliant future, and felt the freezing water soak through his expensive coat. He reached into his pocket and felt the empty space where his wedding ring used to be. Some lies are born from malice, Andrew, but the worst ones, the ones that truly break you, are born from love. He turned his collar up against the wind and began to walk, disappearing into the gray, misty horizon of a life that no longer felt like his own.